First of all, I want to just thank all of you for having me here to talk about this difficult subject. You'll see that there's no reference in my title to omega-3 fatty acids, and I think you'll see that there is no reference to them anywhere in my presentation. So you might ask why I'm here. Well, I'm here to talk about efforts that are now underway to get a method in place, if you like, for developing DRIs, dietary reference intakes, based on chronic disease endpoints. That's a fairly new activity in the US and Canada. This is a US-Canadian effort. The effort is not complete, but I want to give you some highlights of the effort and where we think it's going. And I'll talk about my own role in it to a small degree. First of all, most of you know what these are. This is the simplest definition of a dietary reference intake. I emphasize here first the word quantitative. It's quantitative estimates of intake used for planning and assessing diets for healthy people. That's how the nutrition community uses them. There are many other uses, actually, that have evolved since they were first introduced in their present form in the 1990s in the US and Canada. So they have a very important role, but I emphasize here that they are quantitative estimates. So that we'll come back to that point because that's a very important element of my discussion. They are developed in the US and Canada by an institution called the National Academy of Sciences, and a particular unit of that academy called the Institute of Medicine. Now, you may be surprised to learn that that is not part of the government. This is not a government institution. The National Academy of Sciences was established, in fact, by Abraham Lincoln, and it still exists to provide advice to the government, but it is independent of the government. We could spend a long time on how they go about their work. I've served on many of their committees. You may be interested in that. Maybe we could come back to that later. I don't have time now to go into that. But I would just add that what they say about things, their recommendations are taken as authoritative. So chronic disease endpoints now are being looked at by an expert panel that the governments of US and Canada jointly convened. I'm on that panel as one of 8 or 9 members. And we are charged with developing, I'll emphasize the word options for developing DRIs based on chronic disease endpoints. So what we're doing is setting forth a series of options, how you might proceed in this difficult area. We had a public workshop. We're now working on a report which is going to be published. The report is in final draft form. I cannot reveal what's some of the main conclusions in the report, but I can tell you what it contains and the kinds of things that are being looked at by the report. There were earlier DRI efforts, you all know, that took place at the IOM from 1997 to 2005. There were a lot of DRIs published. The so-called estimated average requirement and the RDA among them. A new item was added, the tolerable upper intake level, the UL, which is to define a level above which you might experience toxicity from nutrient excess. These were all based on traditional deficiency disease and high-level toxicity risks. Although those earlier panels did tackle a few chronic disease endpoints, and I list them here at the bottom. I will say that no clear methodology for doing this emerged from that work, and now that's what we are attempting to do. So the government tells us that they're concerned that we're not taking advantage of developing knowledge about the influence of nutrients and other dietary substances. I will emphasize this is not just about nutrients. It's about all natural components of food, the so-called bioactives. They're included in this analysis. And we think, the government believes, that a lot can be done to deal with chronic disease endpoints if we can find the right methodology for recommending intakes. It is clear, and I think those of us who were working with the DRI committee back in 10 or more years ago, that the current model, I'll show you that model in a second, used for DRIs to date doesn't really work well for chronic diseases, and that's what I want to point out. Three major questions our committee is asked to look at. First, evidentiary challenges, that's a hard word to say, for evaluating the evidence on the relationship between a substance and a chronic disease endpoint. What are those challenges and how can they be dealt with? My emphasis is on, I was asked to work on this because my background is in risk analysis, a lot of emphasis on what's called the dose-response relationship. Dose is a traditional term. For food substances, it's really intake response, intake versus risk of disease. What can we say about those? And then finally, what arguments can be made for and against? I'm not going to talk about that one at all. I think most people feel that if you can do the science and get the science right, then there's good reason to proceed. There's no argument against chronic disease endpoints. Here are the categories of substances. I already mentioned this a bit. Substances not known to have nutritional value. These are dietary substances, so any natural component of food counts. Then what I call nutritionally necessary, you'll see why I use that word in a second. And those substances, point number 2, were the emphasis in the earlier DRI efforts. And the model for developing those DRIs I'll show you here in the next slide. Let me just go right to that. Whoops, holy cow. I did, okay, there it is. Is that right? Yes. Okay, so this is a graphic, sort of a conceptual model of sort of what's called the dose-response or intake-response relationship. Let me just walk you through it, because this describes conceptually how these DRI values are derived. And it's based on some assumptions about things that are nutritionally necessary, or essential, if you like. So begin on the left. The vertical axis is about risk of adverse effects being here on that side of the graph, deficiency. And the risk goes from 0% of the population affected up to 100%. And if you start there on the left with 0 intake of an essential nutrient, everybody gets sick. Okay, so 100% of the population is affected. That's the concept here. As you move across and increase intake, you eventually come to the point where half the population is affected only. That's the EAR, the average requirement, if you like. And then the RDA is derived from that. That's where virtually no one gets sick. So that's what that one describes. And as you go further to the right, you finally hit a point where you might run into toxicity for a nutrient, and you've got to avoid levels of exposure above that. That's the model. That's how these values were developed. The EAR, the RDA, the UL, based on that, what I call a conceptual model. The actual data is much messier than this, but that's the concept, the framework within which these are developed. I would say, just emphasize 2 things that may be completely obvious to you, but let me just emphasize it and say it this way. This is about substances which, if they are absent from the diet, everybody gets sick. And if they are present at a sufficient level, the RDA, let's say, nobody gets sick. So that's something, that kind of relationship, I think we see now, cannot hold for substances which affect chronic disease risk. There is no substance which by itself either in its absence causes a chronic disease or in its presence can prevent it by itself. Chronic diseases are multifactorial. So that model for DRI development is not applicable for chronic diseases. Okay, I will come back to what kind of model is in a second before I end, but now let me just go through very briefly the kind of the steps that we are going through in our report, the committee's report, on sort of guidance, if you like, on what one needs to do to answer the questions I set out before. Strength of the evidence relating the intake of the substance to chronic disease. First of all, you need to be sure we understand what a chronic disease is. I guess most people have an intuitive sense. This is a WHO definition, kind of what guides us. But non-communicable, long duration, slow progression, and multifactorial etiologies. That's a key element here that guides our thinking and the development of dose-response relationships. The key element, and matter of fact, perhaps the greatest emphasis in the report is on the issue of getting to the question of whether there is a relationship between some substance and a disease, either to increase the risk of a disease or to decrease it. A decreased risk is another term for benefit. All right? So that evidence has to be evaluated, and what we have in the report is a great emphasis on systematic review, capital S. If you follow what's been going on in the world of medicine and environmental matters and all kinds of matters, there's a great deal of emphasis and work in the last decade even to get much more systematic ways to look at Adam's 30,000 papers. You've got to go through it in a very careful way. You even develop protocols for the review of data to be sure, again, to quote Adam, there's no cherry picking, that you're giving all the data attention, you're giving the better data more weight than the other. It's a very complicated process, but it has to be done systematically and completely openly. So there's a lot on this. We rely heavily on RCTs and observational studies, but other studies on mechanisms of action and animal studies cannot be neglected. You'll see a lot of emphasis on the fact that if we can explain through mechanistic studies how a substance works, that provides much better weight to the evidence of causation or lack thereof, if you like. So there's an emphasis on all of those evidence streams, integrating the evidence and then applying criteria for causation. So I would say 60% of our paper, it's very dense, 50 or 60 pages, this review, is on these sort of new emerging ways to look at data. Meta-analyses, we heard about that this morning. Those are not the only things to be considered here, but they certainly are important. There are a lot of challenges that come up here. Here are three. There are others as well. Surrogate markers for chronic diseases. Surrogate markers have to be used in many cases. And there's always going to be a debate about what the marker really tells you, whether it's really related to the disease, as it is in the causal pathway. All of that has to be considered. The relevance of findings in studied populations to unstudied populations. This is the element in all risk analysis, whatever we're dealing with, is one of the big difficulties to deal with, because there's inherent variability in response across populations, and it's hard to figure out how much there is, unless you've got awfully well-studied substances. Causation, of course, is always problematic. I would emphasize that causation, a lot of work on the causation here issue also to try to improve the way we think about causation, not so much as a sort of yes-no answer, but as a probabilistic answer. To look at all the evidence, apply causation criteria, and there may be several different kinds of criteria to apply, but to answer the question, how certain are you that the link is causal? Not that you're 100% certain, that's kind of rare, but how certain are you? And then decisions about whether you develop a DRI based on that kind of evidence are almost a kind of policy decision of whether that evidence is strong enough. It's not something that should be left purely to scientists, but that's a hard thing to many people to deal with. Anyway, there's a lot of discussion of that in our report. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the dose-response relationship and what might be some good conceptual models to look at for DRI development here, where we're talking about chronic diseases. And the one I showed you doesn't apply. I think that's fairly obvious, or should be. But to do this, we require information, quantitative information, on the relationship between intake of the substance and disease risk. And this, again, is a conceptual model for chronic disease risk that I think you'll see in our report. There's no reason to hide this one. What this tells you is that in looking at chronic disease risk, the model doesn't have that U-shaped dose-response curve at all that I described earlier. Rather, you begin with the notion that for all chronic diseases, there is a background risk, and that we are measuring effect of substances relative to, it's a relative risk model, to that background risk. And so here are two examples of substances that decrease risk of chronic disease. Now, the graphs here are exaggerated on purpose. Most substances are not going to have effects this large. One of the big problems is for any individual substance, the effect likely to be pretty small. But you've got to be able to untangle that from the data and see whether it's behaving in this way. And that kind of information is going to be useful, not the only kind, but that's certainly one kind of information useful for getting to DRIs. The UL is kept, it's a separate matter. Toxicity, we're not talking about chronic disease here, we're talking about high-level toxicity. That remains in the model here under this. So now what could a DRI look like? Well, here are some possibilities. You could talk about a range of beneficial effects. If you're a baseball fan, you know what an RBI is. But here we've got a new meaning for effects where you begin where there is a discernible decrease in risk. You carry that range of intake to the point where either the risk is returning to background or you run into toxicity. So you try to describe that whole range of possibilities, whole range of intakes that could be associated with reduced risk. That's one definition of a DRI that might emerge. There are other options. It might be the maximum decrease in risk. You might just pick that single point. You might pick some specified percent decrease in risk as what is discernible from the dose response data. So those kinds of options could become new DRIs for beneficial substances. I won't go into this. I assume you think your favorite substance doesn't behave this way. That is increased risk, but there are substances in food and nutrients which can increase risk of chronic disease. The outstanding example today is saturated fat. Sodium, also high intakes of sodium can increase risk of diseases, chronic disease as well. And there are a few other examples that have this kind of behavior. So that also has to be taken into account. These are much more difficult to control, and we've got, perhaps this has been one of the great challenges, how you describe a DRI for substances where you want to reduce risk, but which are components of food that you just can't eliminate without radical changes in the diet. So that is a real challenge, and there will be a substantial discussion in our paper of that. So all of this falls within, we're trying to make this fall within what's called a risk assessment, risk management framework. That is, one question is, what's the risk? The risk assessment provides a good characterization of the evidence for the effect, good or bad, the strength of the effect, for example, the magnitude of risk reduction, and the uncertainties associated with this. Uncertainty comes through as it has to. Every modern risk analyst will tell you that if you're ignoring uncertainty, then your answer is wrong. If you do not describe uncertainties, you do not have a correct scientific answer. But it has to be done in a way where you don't paralyze decisions. You can still make decisions under uncertainty. That's a whole discipline in itself. Whether the RBI or some other measure becomes a recommendation is a risk management decision. That's how you would think of the two. Because the risk manager has to consider how good's the data, how strong is the evidence, what are the uncertainties, and then make a decision, can we go to a DRI? All of this will come back to the IOM, by the way, because we believe, at least I understand, that the IOM is going to get busy again. They have to be engaged by the governments, Canada and US, to begin looking anew at DRIs and also trying to make our guidance that we're going to provide, we hope, actually workable with real examples. We'll see. I'll just emphasize, I've already said this a bit, but for your own benefit, keep in mind that these conceptual models have to be, you have to build them from real data on your favorite dietary substance. Okay, so that's a real challenge. I've heard people who've looked at the area of individual substance and chronic diseases. I've heard opinions that go all over the map. I've heard some very prominent biostatisticians say There's no evidence for a good dose-response relationship for anything. Someone said that at our workshop. I don't know enough about nutrients. I'm not a nutrition scientist to challenge that, but he wasn't strongly challenged, I must say. And then, of course, there's also that element of the nutrition community which says individual substances don't matter, it's just the diet as a whole, and we should stop talking about this sort of thing. But that's not going to end the DRI process. They're too important, and they will be considered. The last bullet on this slide has to do with variability. I mentioned that before. If you've got a strong database that look at different subpopulations, you can get a better idea of the variability in response, and then apply that when you have to DRIs, to be sure you're covering sensitive subpopulations and so forth. I think I'm just about done. The upper levels need more work. The first look at these came in the 90s and the early 2000s. There was really not much toxicity data on nutrient substance, and I think there's a lot less on other constituents of food that have to be considered. And what we had to do was do the best you can, but there's a lot of substances where you've gone to very high exposures without evidence of adverse effect. You've got to find a way to deal with those and say what is a reasonable way to get to some upper level. Okay, I think I am done. We'll keep that conceptual model for nutritionally necessary substances, the U-shaped figure. The others will become the guidelines. And we hope this paper that I think it will be published sometime later this year. It's going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. It won't be public until it's published. But as I said, we think the governments, my understanding is the governments are going to be at the IOM looking to start implementing this in the not too distant future. Thank you.